Today's daf we're going to be learning is Megillah, daf kaftet. I want to thank everyone who joined the beginner's class last night with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. I want to thank Rabbanit Leah for teaching for us. I will remind everybody the recording will be up, so you just have to register for the class, and then everything is accessible in the back office. In other words, once you go into the class, you'll have your lesson there and the materials that were given out. So there's two more classes. One will be after next week's Siyum. So next Sunday, there'll be a Siyum Megillah. If you haven't registered for that, you can register for that. And after that, there'll be 2 more weeks of the beginner's course, which again will be followed by a skills class that kind of will give you the foundations to be confident enough to then delve into and actually start learning sugyot and learning the Gemara on your own. Okay, again, on your own, guided, not throwing you totally on your own. Today's daf is sponsored by Blima Slitsky in loving memory of her mother, Tina Mazal, Batrina, and David. And today's daf is dedicated by Devar Sabam for the refuah shlema of Yosef Azriel ben Achaya Michal, a young boy still in a coma since the Meron tragedy, who is having surgery today. Today's daf is also sponsored by Chaim Nisan in loving memory of Rosh Shmuel Halevi Segal, and by Miki Kadosh in loving memory of Aya Bat Dafna Bahat. Okay. We are going to get started with the bottom, starting from the very last words of Kafchet Amud Bet, Tanu Rabbanit. We learn in a Braita. Okay, we're still on this topic of Batei Knesiot. We're going to get a little bit off topic, which is we were talking about also learning Torah, and now we're going to say Mevatlim Talmud Torah lahotzaat hamet ulahachnasat kala. You can basically leave the Beit Midrash and stop studying Torah for the purposes of Hotzaat HaMet, for taking out a dead, basically for going to a funeral, in other words, basically to Lilavot et HaMet, to escort the dead body, and Lahachnasat Kala, to bring in a Kala into marriage, also to go to a wedding, basically. Okay, these are like always deliberations, right? What can you leave the Beit Midrash to do? So here it seems to say, no problem, you can do those things. Those things are of utmost importance. But we're going to see that there's a little bit of a limitation. However, the limitation is going to be a little bit absurd. Okay, and you have to wonder what exactly they're getting at here. Amru alav Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli. Okay, in case you didn't believe us, right? They say about Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Eli. This is the famous Rabbi Yehuda. Shayam mevatel Talmud Torah lotza'at hamet ulachnasat kala. Okay, some people say even though all he did all day was learn Torah, he was allowed to write Torah, Manuto. We learned people like that don't even necessarily have to daven. But yet, he was mevatel Talmud Torah for these two very important mitzvot, Hotza'at Hamet and Hachnasat Kala. However, they say now, in which case is this the situation? B'she'ein sham kol tzorko. This is if there aren't enough people. Okay? Aval. Yesham kol tzorko ein mevatzlim. But if there are enough people, then you don't. Now, this becomes a very big question. What does it mean, enough people? What is enough people for these mitzvot? It's very hard to know. So the Gemara is going to obviously ask that. Bekama kol tzorko, Amar Rav Shmuel bar Inya mishmei derav, tcheisar alfei gavre v'shita alfei shipure. Here comes the very large numbers. Okay, it's not enough unless you have 12,000 men and 6,000 shofar blowers. Okay, that's already 18,000 people. If there's 18,000 people, right, you think about sometimes you go to these weddings and you say, wow, weddings have gotten much bigger than they were when we were younger, right? Huge weddings, but they're certainly not, at least most of them are not in these numbers. Forget about now, where for sure nobody would get together with that many people. But basically, it sounds like what they're saying is that it's an absurd number that's considered kol tzorko. It almost nullifies this entire halacha and says, well, this issue that it's only as long as you have enough people, there is no such thing as enough people. Okay, but if you thought this number was exaggerated, just wait. Okay, so right now we're up to 18,000. Now the Gemara says, some people say, though, it's not 12,000 and another 6,000. It's tcheisar alfei gavre uminayu shita alfei shipure. Within the 12,000, it's 6,000 shofar blowers. Okay, so altogether 12,000, not 18,000. In case you thought that number was too high, well, we've dropped it down. Okay, even though, right, it's not dropped down that much in terms of, realistically. Ula Amar, he says, if he tries to describe it in a way that you could imagine how many people go from the gate of the city out to the grave. Okay, that would be the distance. Rav Sheshet Amar, kinitinata kach nitilata. Now Rav Sheshet says The way we receive the Torah is the way the Torah goes out. Meaning, if a Torah scholar dies, we have to honor the Torah scholar in the same way it was when we received the Torah. Now, how many people were there when we received the Torah? How many people came out of Egypt? Shishim Ribo, 600,000. So Rosh Sheshita says, Manitinata b'shishim ribo, af nitilata b'shishim ribo. Okay, now we get to the most exaggerated numbers, right? If there aren't 600,000 people, then you basically have to stop learning Torah and go, because a Talmud Chacham, right? 600,000 is the number. Hanemile, but then we qualify this. This is someone who reads, like he knows Psukim, he knows Braitot, he's Tane. This is what we talked about yesterday, right? Where, if you remember, Rav Nachman insulted someone like that and said, oh, you're just like, you kind of hold a book in your hand. You're a book, but you're not much more than a book. But now this 600,000 number, even though Rav Nachman kind of put down a person like that, then you get 600,000 because you're a Torah scholar. But if you're matne, now again, there's a difference. What's the difference between Tane and matne? Some people say it's to learn versus to teach. Some people say it's to recite, and then matne is to really learn it in depth. If you're of that caliber, however we define that, then late shiur, then there's no limit to how many people can come to your funeral. Okay, basically meaning, and it's not a limit of how many people can come, but it's really an issue of how many people we're supposed to, do you say, oh, I won't leave the Beit Midrash for this? The other obvious problem is, how are you supposed to know how many people are showing up to the funeral and whether or not we're going to get to that number or not? I just wanted to point out one thing. I just want to double check that I'm right in having read this 1 minute, that I believe that the halacha, 1 second, let me just double check this. Right, 1 second. To the honor, even thousands. Right, that the issue is, right, so first of all, la halacha, they say that most people actually have learned something, and therefore kind of everyone is basically in that category. There's a whole debate about women. Where do women come up? Where do children come up? Where do they come in? Anyway, there's different things about that. There's different questions about whether, just 1 second, I wanted to see one thing. Right. There's something. Okay, I don't see it right now. Anyway, so there's a question asked about women. There's a question asked about children. There's an issue about taking children out of school, that maybe that's never done. You never take children out of school for any reason. Anyway, there's all sorts of interesting things about this. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next section. Tanya, we were talking about the Kedusha of the Beit Knesset, right? The fact that the Beit Knesset has sanctity to it. So now we're going to get to almost like, where does the sanctity come from? Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Bo re'eh kama chavivim Yisrael lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Let's see how much God loves the Jewish people. Shebechol makom shegalu shchina imahem, wherever they went into exile, the divine presence went along with them. Galu leMitzrayim shchina imahem. When they went to Egypt, the divine presence went with them. How do we know this? Shene'emar. Okay, this is a verse in where the Navi speaks to Eli in Sefer Shmuel, and he says to him, didn't I reveal myself in Mitzrayim, okay, to the Jewish people? Now, niglo nigleti, why is it double language? To say that not only did they go into exile in Egypt, but God went with them in exile. Galula Bavel Shchinai Mehem. How do we know this? Shne'emal. We actually have learned this before. Le'manchem shulachti Bavel. And because of you, I was sent to Bavel, God says. God went to Bavel with us, that means. In the future, when we will be redeemed, the divine presence will go along with us. What does this mean? And that's, how do we know this? God will return those who will bring us back to the land. Now, what should it have said? V'heshiv lo ne'amar. It doesn't say, and God will bring us back in the language that's normally used, heshiv, but it says v'shav. Now, v'shav literally means he will go back, he will return, right? Heshiv is to bring someone else. So basically, the fact that it says v'shav, right? Lo v'heshiv lo ne'amar, ela v'shav, melamed shakadosh baruch hu shav imahen mibein hagaliyot. That means God is going to go back with us. He'll return. So basically, there's this idea that the divine presence went to exile with the Jews. So now the question is, the biggest question, right? So the rabbis are living in Babylonia, so they want to know, where can you find the Shechina? So, Amar Abaye, bebeit Knishta de Hutza. Okay, in the shul in Hutza, that's where you can find it. Bebeit Knishta de Shafi Yativ ben Harda. Okay, there's one in Hutza where you can find it, and there's one called Shafi Yativ, whether that was its name, or literally Shafi Yativ means it was destroyed and rebuilt. So you can find it in that shul, the one that was destroyed and rebuilt in the Hardea. Now, don't think, okay, even though I grew up on this song, right? Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, okay, right? That God is everywhere, but don't think that God's presence is there and there. Because even though we believe God is everywhere, the actual divine presence can only really be in one place, okay? Again, whatever this means, it's hard to understand this concept, and you'll see from some interesting stories later, the way they viewed it. Okay, we'll get back there, but don't think it's in both places. Okay, the divine presence basically moves from Hutzel to Shafi Yativ and back. So now we're going to see some stories. I should be rewarded when I'm within a parsa of either of these shuls. What do? I go into that one of those shuls if I'm anywhere in the vicinity, and I pray there. It's almost like when you're near the kotel, right? It's hard to be somewhere near the kotel. Let's say you have a meeting in the old city somewhere and you're not going to go to the kotel and daven, right? You're so close. Abai says, anytime I'm somewhere near, I make sure to go there and daven. Now we're going to see some strange stories of people who encounter the divine presence in these places. Okay, whatever this means, it's hard to understand, but we'll try to understand these stories despite the difficulty involved. The father of Shmuel and Levi, and that's the father of Shmuel and Levi. They were sitting in the shul. The Shechina came. How did they know the Shechina was coming? So what happened this week that reminded me of this? So my daughter comes home one day. We happen to live in the city where the Rosh Mimshalah, the prime minister, lives. So she says, the prime minister went for glasses this week. I said, or for an eye appointment. Like, how did you know? Well, she said, well, I was on the main drag and, everything was closed off and it was all around. There was this whole thing centered on this eyeglass store. We were joking like, oh, where does he get his glasses? And where does he go, shopping for, dealing with his eyes anyway. So he was in this eyeglass place and, there was security outside. There was this. When the prime minister comes, everybody knows the prime minister's there because there's a whole, we call in Hebrew a hamula, right? There's a whole tumult going. So apparently, when the divine presence comes, and this is the way the rabbis tell the story, right? They tell it in a similar way. There's a big ruckus. Okay, they hear all this. Okay, we're going to see it right now. Shamu kol rigsha. They heard all these noises and some sort of right, and they sensed must be the divine presence is coming. What's the ruckus of God coming? Because he has all the angels that escort God. It's, that's why I thought, again, the Havdil, I'm not comparing at all. But when you think of the prime minister with the cars and the sirens, and there's a whole tumult going when he moves around. So likewise here, they heard this big noise. So what's their reaction? Right now, the question is, what would you do if the divine presence was coming? Do you stay or do you leave? So Kamu v'nafku, they got up and they left right away. They were scared to be in the presence of the divine presence. It's scary. So Rav Sheshet, we're going to see a different story. You have to remember Rav Sheshet was blind. Okay, he was in the Beit Knesset of Shafi Yativ ben Hardas, same shul. Atya Shechina v'lo nafa. Same thing happened. It comes now. He should have heard it because he's blind, not deaf, and yet he doesn't move. He doesn't get out. Well, the angels didn't like this. So Atu Malachei Sharet become a vatule. They try to scare him into leaving. So what's his reaction? Amar lefanav, he says, Ribono shel olam, aluv v'she'eno aluv mi nidchem mipnei mi. If you have someone who's in a bad situation and you have someone who's, everything's good for them, who would you move out first? Okay, and he's basically saying, I'm blind. You're not going to start moving me around. It's hard for me to move. In other words, if someone's going to have to move, it should be the angels and not me. Okay, and he basically stands up for himself. And Amar Lahu, God said to the angels, Shivkuhu, leave him and let him stay. Interesting stories. I don't know what exactly you make of them, but they had this sense that the divine presence was actually among them. And where, of course, would it be? In the Beit Knesset, because they no longer have anything else. And this stuff is going to really start showing us how the Beit Knesset is like, and we'll see this exactly in the next few words, is they wanted to basically recreate the temple, right? This is, again, we've talked about this before. The lack of temple in their lives was a big issue. So they want to try to find it within what they have in existence. This is a quote, okay, from a pasuk in Yechezkel, which basically it's important to read the whole pasuk. It says there, this is what God said, Ki hirchiktem bagoyim, when I distance you and send you, when I throw you far away into the goyim, v'chi, right, into foreign nations, v'chi hafitzotim ba'aratzot, and when I scatter you around to all the other lands, ve'hi lachem limikdash ma'at ba'aratzot asher ba'u sham, I will be for you like a mini mikdash. Okay, so now they say, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, where is this? Where do you find this? Elu batei knesiot u'batei midrashot shebebavel. You can find this in shuls and in batei midrash where people learn, right? Those are the places where you can find the divine presence. The Rabbi Elazar Amar, Ze Beit Rabbeinu shebebavel. He says, this is the house of our rabbi in Bavel, which was Rav. Okay, Rabbi Elazar, who was known, most famous for being a student of Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael in Israel, but he first learned with Rav in Bavel. So notice, I want you to just notice one thing. Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Elazar are both scholars from Israel that are talking about the situation in Babylonia, which is interesting because you would have thought this would be said by the Babylonian rabbis, but specifically it's not. Amar Rabbi, Darash Rav. My dichtiv, Rav and Abai are now going to darshan two psukim. Each one talks about ma'on, which is a place of dwelling. So, my dichtiv, Hashem ma'on atah hayita lanu. You are our home, right? Our place where we dwell. In other words, really, which is God is dwelling. Okay, that, thanks for the word, Ruth, abode. Okay, that I was struggling to find the word, right? You are our abode. So now, so where is that? In the Batei Midrash, in the Batei Knesset. Amar Abaye, meresh havagaris na bebeta. I used to learn in my house. Umatzel in Beit Knesset, and I would go in Beit Knesset, and I would go daven in the shul. Kevan deshamet lahadkamar David. Hashem ahavti ma'on beitecha. These are both from Tehillim, right? He says, ahavti, God loves the ma'on beitecha, his abode. Havagarsia garis na bebeit Knesset. I started to go learn in the shul because I realized better off going to the abode of God and where he is. So therefore, interesting. Okay, so I have it wrong. It's that David loves God's house, but I think here it's saying that, right, I see, right. Abai, okay, so Abai says, once I heard David say, I love the house of God, then he decided that he should go be learning in the Beit Knesset. Tanya, Rabbi Elazar Kapar Omer, Atidim batei knesiot u'batei midrashot shebebavel sheyikavu be'eretz Yisrael. This is an interesting one. Okay, so now we don't normally, right? I'm thinking of the Wizard of Oz when the house goes flying and it drops land somewhere else. So in the future, all these shuls, the question is, what's going to be with this? In other words, what they're trying to basically establish is their center, right? That Bavel is now the center, and the Mikdash has almost moved there. They're almost saying, but they understand that this is Jewish history, and they're just a moment in history. And at some point, it's all going to go to Israel. Well, what's going to happen to all those places where God's presence dwelled? Well, those are going to be moved back into Israel. I don't think they literally meant it's going to be moved back. Although I was thinking about those shuls you can go visit in the Israel Museum that look exactly like synagogues from the Galut, but I don't think that that's what they meant, that they would be in a museum. But the idea being that this concept of the divine presence will be back in Israel in the future. But they do discuss it as if literally they're going to be moved. And now they bring some proofs for how can literally things be moved and put in Israel. Well, Shanema, ki katavor baharim u'Carmel bayam yavo. The same way Tavor in the mountains was brought to Israel and Carmel was brought to the sea. Also, that's how these things can be moved. Now, what are you talking about? Tavor and Carmel, aren't they in Israel? Well, the idea here is that those places, according to our tradition, were somewhere else. They came forward to God and said, if you remember the famous Midrash, when it comes time, right, we learned this as children, that Har Sinai, why was the Torah given on Har Sinai? Because it's the smallest of all the mountains, and it seems strange. Wouldn't the Torah be given on a tall mountain? And they say that really all the mountains came forward, and these big tall mountains like Tavor and Carmel, they came forward and they said, we want the Torah given on our mountain. And God said, you are arrogant, and your arrogance is, right, the Torah cannot be given in a place of arrogance, and therefore not. But they did get a reward for wanting to have the Torah on them. And what their reward was is that they were brought to Israel. That's what we derive. The Midrash derives from these verses. Okay, so just like Tavor and Carmel were moved to Israel because they wanted the Torah to be given on them, so now they're going to say like this. They only came for a moment. They wanted to just be, for a slice of time in history. When the Torah was given, they wanted to be the ones it was given on. And what was their reward? Nikibaim be'eretz Israel. They got placed in Israel. So the shuls and the Batei Midrash where people are sitting learning Torah. And think about it, during the time of the Babylonian, when the Talmud was put together, there was so much learning going on there. Of course, those are going to ultimately be moved to Israel. Okay, again, what this exactly means is a very good question, right? I don't think they meant this to be literal. Darash bar kapal. He darshan the following thing. If we're talking about these mountains, my dechtiv lama tiratzdun harim gavnunim. This is a verse in Tehillim. The word tiratzdun is a very strange word. So they explain, and what is harim gavnunim? So yatzda bat kol, the way the Midrash understands here is a heavenly voice came down and said to them, Lama tirtzu din im Sinai. Tiratzdun is a combination of two words, tiratzu din. Why do you want to be judged with Har Sinai? You have no chance. Kulchem ba'alei mumim atem etzel Sinai. You all are blemished compared to Har Sinai. Why? Because you're arrogant. Okay, and that's what we're going to see. We're going to say in a minute that arrogance is clearly a blemish. Ktiv hacha. How do we get this, that they're blemished? Because it says gavnunim, they're called. Uktiv hatam o giben odak. In the list of blemishes, there's giben, which is a hunchback. Some people explain it differently, but we'll go with the hunchback explanation. Odak could be some problem with your eye. It could be some other issue. I'm not going to get into that. So Rav Ashi says you can derive from here that one who's arrogant is considered a blemish. Okay, and that's why we see these mountains didn't in the end get to be the ones that the Torah was given on. However, they were rewarded. They were brought to Israel. From there, we're going to learn that, of course, the shuls and the Batei Midrash from Bavel are going to ultimately be replanted in or moved to Israel. Back to shul. What can be done to shul? What can't be done to shul? We're going to go back to the Mishnah. Eino simoto kapandaria. You can't make it a shortcut. So my kapandaria, where does this word come from? Right? Obviously, it comes from a different language. It doesn't come from Hebrew. If you were at the Shiur last night, you'll learn that, with Rabbanit Leah pointed out what we talk about a lot, which is a lot of the words come from the Greek. But the rabbis like to have some connection to the Hebrew language when they have a strange word like this. So amalava kapandaria kishma, exactly as it sounds, which that didn't help us very much. My kishma, how is that? Kimanda amal, it's like someone who says, adim makifna, okay, kuf pe in the beginning of the word is short for adim makifla, until I makif. To makif is to go around. Until I go around, adare eobaha. Okay, instead of taking the roundabout route, I'll just go straight through. Okay, that's what they're saying. Kapandaria is, okay, it's short for Ad Makifna. Adare, if I go all around this place, then I can just go through. It's much shorter. Now we're going to have all sorts of limitations on this rule. Sounds like you can't use the shul as a shortcut. However, there are certain ways you can. Number one, if this was originally a throughway, and then they built the shul there, then you're still allowed to go, because you're basically, by building the shul there, you're preventing people from going the way they normally went. So that case, it would be allowed. If you go into the shul with the intent, let's say to daven, and then you decide to go out the other way because it's quicker to get out that way to where you're going, then you can do that. Okay, so if you go into daven, you're allowed to use it then to go out the other way, and we're going to prove it from a verse. This is in a pasuk in Yechezkel, right? I'm just in Yechezkel, where it describes the future temple. It says when people are going to come to pray on the holidays or to worship God, the ones who come in from the north gate to bow, will leave on the south gate. So first of all, there's something positive to going in one end and going out the other, maybe because you get through the whole thing. I don't know, but it clearly indicates if you want to go in one way and go out the other way, you're allowed to. Now we get back to the weeding issue. Aluba asavim lo yitlosh mipnei agma nefesh. We want people to be yearning for the rebuilding of it, so leave the weeds growing. V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a Braita though? You can't uproot it in order to feed your animals, like weed the grass so that you can feed them to your animals. But you can weed it out and just leave it in its place. So the Gemara says, and then it seems to disagree with our Mishnah, which seems to say you can't weed it at all. Well, our Mishnah really meant don't weed it in order to feed to the animals, but you can just leave it there because, again, that makes it still look abandoned. Tanu Rabbanit. Now we're moving to a totally different topic, although very similar, to a cemetery. What kind of respect you have to show in a cemetery? Very similar to a shul. Beit HaKvarot ein noagim be'en kalu rosh. The same title. You can't be lightheaded there. You can't do things that are frivolous activities. Ein mar'im behem behema. You can't let your animals graze there. Ein molichim behem mayim. You can't put a channel water through the cemetery. Ein melaktim ben asavim. You also can't do the weeding. V'im likate. And if you did, sorfam bimkomam, you have to burn them in their place. Some people say this is a knas, a penalty, that we make you burn it so that you don't use it for anything else. Some people say it's actually forbidden to benefit from, just like we talked about the burial shrouds are forbidden. Maybe here it's asur b'hana'ah, as we call it, and therefore the only thing you could do with them is to burn them. So machlok at what this exactly is. Mipnei kvod hametim. Okay, it sounds like if you read this, the way, right, there's always a issue of modifiers. Because of kvod hametim, it sounds like you have to burn them in its place. So the Gemara says, Ahaya, what's these words, mipnei kvod hametim? To what is it referring? Ahaya means on what was this said? Ilem aseifa, if it's on the end, kevan shesufram bimkomam, my kvod hametim ika. Why is it respect to the dead that you're burning it in its place? That's not really respectful to the dead. So they say, Ela Aresha, must be referring to the first part of the Mishnah, which is all those things can't be done in a cemetery because of respect for the dead, right? It's just interesting in general. There's this concept of respect for the dead. They're not even alive anymore, and yet you still have to show respect, okay, which is similar to where we started about how you can be mevatel Talmud Torah to go escort a dead person. New Mishnah. Now we're getting to what you read on what days. And we're going to start with the Arba Parshiot, and specifically Parshat Shkalim, the first of the 4 Parshiot, right? So we're going to learn them right now if you don't know what they are. Rosh Chodesh Adar, on the Rosh Chodesh Adar, if Rosh Chodesh, Shechali Yom Shabbat, if it falls on Shabbat, Korim b'Parashat Shkalim. We're going to learn these 4 Parshiot are read on Shabbatot. So either the Shabbat of Rosh Chodesh Adar, if it falls on Shabbat, or Chali Yom Shabbat, if it was during the week. Makdimin l'sha'avar, then you read the week before Rosh Chodesh Adar, you read Parshat Shkalim, which we'll see soon what it is. And if you think you know what it is, you might be a little bit surprised, because there's actually a machloket about what we read for Parshat Shkalim, which is going to be most of what we're going to deal with for the next section. Mafsikin l'shabbat acheret. Okay, then you skip a week. There's nothing after the week after. But b'shniya zachor, b'shlishit para aduma, b'revi'it hachodesh hazeh lachem, right? And then you go, the next week is zachor. The next week, right, which comes out before Purim. The next week is Parshat Para aduma, because people had to become pure before the holiday of Pesach. And then the week before, or Rosh Chodesh Nisan, or the week before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, you read Parshat HaChodesh, which is all about hachodesh hazeh lachem. We read that we just read that in Shul, in Parshat Bo. B'chamishit chozrim lekisidran. Then you just go back to the regular Torah readings. We'll get back to this, okay? Because the question is not clear from here. I just want to point out, not clear from here whether you know chozrim lesidran. It sounds like, okay, we're used to, what do we do in Shul on the 4 Parshiot? We read the regular Parshat Shavua, and then it's just the maftir, and the haftarah has to do with the Parshat, right? The whatever that week is. So the Torah reading we read in maftir, and then we read the haftarah that's connected. But this could be read in 2 ways. Chozrin lekisidran, it sounds like maybe you didn't even read the regular parsha then. Maybe you skipped the Parshat Shavua that week, and the whole Parshat Shavua, the whole Torah reading was all based on this. And we'll see there's 2 opinions about that later, which we're going to see all sorts of things that you're used to being a Torah reading. It's not so clear that the Torah reading was the way it was then. Okay, next. Lakol mafsikin. The Mishnah finishes now and says for all other holidays, we stop the regular Torah reading, right? This is what we do on Sukkot. We read on Sukkot that falls on Shabbat. We read a special Torah reading for Sukkot. We don't read the Parsha of that week. And b'Roshei Chodeshim, b'Chanukah, b'Purim, b'Taniyot, b'Mamadot, b'Yom Kippurim, right? All these days also. Rosh Chodesh, right? If they fall on a weekday, and let's say it was a Monday, Thursday, or Yom Kippur, it doesn't mean Yom Kippur in the morning. They're talking about Yom Kippur Mincha. Let's say it was Shabbat Mincha. You don't read what you normally read Shabbat Mincha. You read the Yom Kippur reading, okay? So these kind of replace the other ones. They come instead. Now we're going to quote from Shkalim. Okay, remember we learned Shkalim. It was the one Yerushalmi that was in the Daf Yomi. So there's a mission in Shkalim. We start announcing about the Machatzita shekel, that everyone has to bring the Machatzita shekel to the temple. What was it used for? We'll see this soon, but I'll already tell you the Machatzita shekel was used to buy the sacrifices that were the communal offering sacrifices, like the Korban Tamid, the one on Shabbat, the one on Rosh Chodesh, for all the holidays, etc. So on the first of Adar, we'd start announcing it's time to bring the Shkalim. And we would announce about kilayim. Kilayim is when you have mixed breeds of things that are growing in your field. So the Gemara says, so you would start announcing to people you have to uproot. If something's growing next to something else, you have to uproot it. So the Gemara says, Bishlama ala kilayim. I understand the timing of the kilayim. Dizman zriyayi. This is when you plant it and things are starting to grow, and it's the appropriate time to be announcing about it. Ela ala shkalim minalam. But what do the shkalim have to do with Chodesh Adar? So Amar Rabbi Tavi, Amar Rabbi Yoshia, we're going to return to the statement a number of times. Ta'amar Ka, the pasuk says, Zot olat chodesh bechodsho. Okay, this is what you're supposed to bring, the sacrifice you're supposed to bring on a monthly basis. So they say, Amra Torah chadesh v'havei korban mi truma chadasha. Bring the korban from the new trumot, from the new money that you get. If you remember Masechet Shkalim, one of the main things we learned is that they're tormim et halishka. They take all the money that was collected and they take the first bunch and they start buying korbanot tamid with this. Okay, they start buying the sacrifice that they need for that part of the year, and they do this on Nisan. So because they do it in Nisan, so you already have to start announcing from Adar because the money has to get there in time for Nisan. So now they say, Kiman, this whole thing, by the way, is Dilo ke Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. He must not agree with this, that we start on Rosh Chodesh Adar. Why? Because Rosh Chodesh Adar is an entire month before Nisan. So, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel ha'amar shtei Shabbatot. He holds that things are supposed to be done 2 weeks before, not a month before. So now let's go back and let's see. What's his machloket? Tanya. Shoalim b'ilchot Pesach kodem lePesach 30 yom. Now you'll notice this isn't exactly the same thing, but this is about learning the halachas about that holiday. So Tanakama says you have to learn about the holidays of Pesach 30 days before Pesach. You need a whole month to learn about them. Shimon Gamliel says 2 weeks is sufficient. So therefore, we're assuming if you have to start telling people, bring the shkalim to the temple, you should only do it according to Rashbag through 2 weeks before. So this whole thing about reading shkalim Rosh Chodesh Adar must not hold like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. To which the Gemara says, no, afilu tema Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, right? Afilu tema is a word that means, oh, I can explain this also according to the opinion you thought doesn't work out with. Kevan de amar mar b'chamisha sarbo shulchanot yoshvim b'medina ubekafeh yoshvim b'mikdash. This was a Mishnah, also Masechet Shkalim that we learned, because it says, on the 15th of the month, they'd already put up tables. And it's not just tables, but a shulchani is someone who's a money changer. And he would accept the money and give them change if they needed. They already put out people all around the country. Ubekafeh yoshvim b'mikdash. And on the 25th of the month, they sit in the temple. Mishum shulchanot kadmina b'kalinan. Since the tables are set up already at the beginning, in the middle of the month, so 2 weeks before that comes out Rosh Chodesh Adar. So even according to Rashbag, you can still explain that they would do it from Rosh Chodesh. Because it's not like, right, on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, they already take the money that's collected. But money needs time to get collected. So they would start collecting earlier. Now comes the big question that's going to take us through a big section of what's left of the daf. My Parashat Shkalim. What do we read for Parashat Shkalim? So Rav Amal, Savit B'nai Yisrael, V'amarta Alehem, Et Korbani Lachmi. This might sound familiar. If not, I'll remind you. We just learned this. This is what we read on Rosh Chodesh. Remember, we had a whole problem with that Rosh Chodesh Kriyah. You read about the Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice. You read about Rosh Chodesh, Shabbat, the sacrifice you bring on Shabbat, and then the one you bring on Rosh Chodesh. That's what we read for Parashat Shkalim. Why? So we're going to see in a minute. Okay, you could try to already figure out, but that's what they say. Okay, it's strange because that's not what we read. Ushmuel amal ki tisa. Right? Ki tisa, when you want to count the people, you tell them to bring, this is in Shemot, you tell them to bring the shkalim. And then what they were really doing there was they were bringing the shkalim to the temple so that they could build, to the tabernacle, so that they could build the tabernacle. That's what it was really meant for, building the tabernacle, the shkalim that were talked about in the Torah there. So that's the section we read. So the Gemara says, Bishlama, okay, we're now going to have, the structure is going to be all together. We're going to have, I'll tell you kind of the perspective of the whole thing, and then I'll tell you the order. 4 questions on Rav, which makes sense that we have all these questions because we don't hold like him. 1 question on Shmuel, and 1 support for Shmuel. But the order is going to be question on Rav, question on Shmuel, 3 more questions on Rav, support for Shmuel from a bright. So here goes. First question against Rav. Bishlama lamanda amar ki tisa. Makes a lot of sense. It's talking about the shkalim, so it makes perfect sense. And that's why, right, to us, it's a no-brainer. It's about the shkalim. That's about the shkalim. It's called Parshat Shkalim. It makes perfect sense. It doesn't say anything about shkalim in that section. So they say, no, really, why? Tamamai, Rabbi Tavi, as Rabbi Tavi said, the whole purpose of the shkalim was to buy the sacrifices. So, of course, what are we going to talk about? The sacrifices that were bought with the shkalim. It's true, it doesn't mention shkalim, but it's what they did with the shkalim. So it makes perfect sense. So we've answered the first question. Now back to Shmuel with a question on Shmuel. Bishlaman, this is the only question on Shmuel. Bishlaman lamanda amar tzav b'nei Yisrael, mishum dichti bekorbanot atam. And then again, if you assume, right, Kidder Rabbi Tavi, if you say like Rabbi Tavi, the whole purpose, which everyone agrees, purpose of the shkalim was to buy the korbanot tzibur. So it makes sense that we're reading about what the money went to buy. Ela lamanda amar kitisa korbanot miktivi, but there's no mention of korbanot in kitisa. For what are they collecting the money? Shkalim la'adanim ktivi. They're for the sockets, okay? They would have these beams and they would put them in the sockets, and the money went to that. So what does this have to do with sacrifices? That was a one-time collection of money for these sockets, has nothing to do with sacrifices. Why are we talking about this now? So say, no, it's not exactly true what you just said. Kiditani Rav Yosef, shalosh trumotin. They collected money for 3 purposes. Shal mizbeach lemizbeach, that's the one we want. For the altar, meaning they had, 3 kind of kupot there, 3 boxes of 3 pushkas. One was for the mizbeach, for the sacrifices. That's the one that we're referring to here, right, when we read it. Shal adanim la'adanim, the one for the sockets went to the sockets. V'shal bedek habayit lebedek habayit, and one went for upkeep, right? When you build a shul, you need to have a fund for maintenance of the building. So one went for maintenance. Okay. Bishlama lamanda amar, back to Rav and questions on Rav. Bishlama lamanda amar kitisa. Kitisa makes perfect sense because hainu deshane hay rosh chodesh mishar v'shei chodeshim, right? Then on Rosh Chodesh, let's say Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbat, on a regular month. So you read the section of Rosh Chodesh. When Parshat Shkalim falls out, you read Kitisa. So it's obviously different. But Lamanda Amar Tzavet Korbani, Ma'ishane. But if you say that the reading on Parshat Shkalim is the exact same thing as the reading on Rosh Chodesh, then basically, how is Parshat Shkalim different from a regular Rosh Chodesh that falls on Shabbat? It's the exact same thing. And then it doesn't stand the whole idea. We're going to have a special reading to talk about the Shkalim, and this is rated basically the same as Rosh Chodesh. There's no difference. So how do we differentiate it? So the Gemara says, Shani. No, it is different. And here's where I said we're going to learn a little bit about how they read from the Torah in those days. Okay, in those days, it seems like, and we had this debate actually, it's interesting, but it seems like they read 6 aliyot. Right now we read 7 aliyot and then Rosh Chodesh. But they read 6 aliyot and the last of the regular parsha, and the last one was Rosh Chodesh. The ilu ha'idna on Parshat Shkalim kulu b'derosh Chodesh. You don't read the regular parsha. And this is where I said there were 2 different ways of understanding it. According to this, they didn't read the parsha at all. They just read Parshat Shkalim, which is actually right to think about splitting into 7 aliyot. We had enough issues splitting into 4, right? They had to somehow split it to 7. So the Gemara says, Hani chalamanda amar l'seder prashiot u'chozer. This is when it said, and they go, right, the 5th week, they go back to the regular thing that they used to do. If you say they go back to reading the parsha, and for 4 weeks they didn't read the parshat Shavua, then this makes sense. But lamanda amar l'seder haftarot u'chozer u'parshata diyoma karina. But to those who say that we do it like we do, which is when it says you go back to normal, what it means is the Haftorah goes back to the normal maftir and the normal Haftorah for that week, and not the one that was special for these special weeks. Then my shani, then it's really no different, because again, you have 6 aliyot of the Parsha, one of Rosh Chodesh, and then in Parshat Shkalim, you have 6 aliyot of the Parsha and one of the Rosh Chodesh reading, which is for Parshat Shkalim, and then it comes out exactly the same. So according to that, it doesn't make sense, right? So what do they answer? No, Shani. It is different, even that. Why? And again, you learn something different about how they split things up then. That's the way we've been saying. 6 and then 1. By the way, I made a chart for this at the very end of this sheet. For Parshat Shkalim, they did 3 aliyot about the Parshat Shavua, and 4 aliyot, the Rosh Chodesh laning was split up into 4. So on a regular Rosh Chodesh, it was only read as 1 aliyah. On Parshat Shkalim, they split into 4 aliyot. It took a much more central role in Parshat Shavua and the reading of the Torah, I should say. And therefore, it stood out, and that was different. Another question on Rav. Meitiv. Rosh Chodesh Adar Shechaliyot b'Shabbat korim b'Parshat Shkalim u'maftirim b'Yehoyada Kohen. Okay, so when Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbat and you read Parshat Shkalim, what do you read? You read the Parsha, whatever that is, we don't know yet, and you do the maftir of Yehoyada Kohen, which is basically about how he basically collects money to fix up the temple, and the money's collected, etc. So they say, if you're saying kitisa is the reading, then the Haftarah always has to be connected to the parsha. So it makes perfect sense. It's really not so much from this part of the verse, it's from the earlier part of the verse, which is kesef nefshot or ko, and before that talks about how they collected money. So it's very much like shkalim. But leman damarit korbani lachmi, where it's all about sacrifices, midame. It's not really similar because they were not really talking about sacrifice. They collected all this money, but it doesn't say that it went to sacrifices. So they say, what do you mean? Dame kederabi tavi, the same answer they keep giving, which is, what else was the money going to if not for sacrifices? Yes, some of it went to fix up the temple, but also the money went to sacrifices, and therefore it's alluding to that. Any collection of money is going to sacrifices, and therefore it fits. Last question on Rav, and then we'll have our proof on Shmuel, and then we'll move on to something similar but different. Meitive. If it ends up that the week you're reading, again, we're going to learn about Torah reading in those days, the week that you're reading is next to, let's say you're reading Kitisa, and then Parshat Kitisa comes up the next week or the previous week in the Parshat Shavua. So if it ends up with Parshat Smuchala, that the week before, the week after, Ben Milafana, Ben Lachare is the exact same Parsha. You say it twice, 2 weeks in a row. Right? This happens sometimes. So Bishlam Alamand Amar Kitisa. It makes sense, by the way, only for Kitisa. Hainu Dimitrame Ba'uzimna. Because we're not up to Bamidbar at that time of the year. Never. Bamidbar never comes up in around, Adar. El Lamand Amar Tzavet Korbani Mimitrame Ba'uzimna. If you say it's Rosh Chodesh, it's never then. Kitisa Dafka comes up right around then, and it could happen. So what do they answer? In the B'nai Ma'arava Damaski the Doraita B'Tlachnin. In Israel, they didn't read Parshat Shavua the way we do. They read it once every 3 years. They did an entire cycle once every 3 years. So then Bamidbar could theoretically come out that time of year. So now we're going to bring a bright to Tanya Kapatei Shmuel. So we brought 4 questions against Rav. We answered all the questions. And 1 against Shmuel, which we also answered. Tanya Kavatei Shmuel, a bright to support Shmuel. Rosh Chodesh Adar Shechaliyot b'Shabbat korin kitisa maftirim b'Yehoyada Kohen. There it says it explicitly. We read kitisa. Now we're going to have 2 statements of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. We're going to have to explain why he said them both, and then in the end we're going to say he didn't actually really say them both. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Rosh Chodesh Adar Shechaliyot b'Shabbat. If Rosh Chodesh comes out on Shabbat, what do? Motzin shalosh Torot. We take out 3 Torahs. V'korim behen echad b'Inyano shel Yom, 1 the Parsha. Echad b'shel Rosh Chodesh, because it's Rosh Chodesh, and echad b'shel Kitisa. Okay, and then you'd have to read Kitisa. This, you see, by the way, is also Shmuel, and there you see you'd have to take out 3 Torahs. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. He also said the Rosh Chodesh Tevet shechaliyot b'Shabbat. We had this year. Rosh Chodesh Tevet is on Shabbat. Mevi'in shalosh Torot v'korim behem echad b'Inyano shel Yom, echad b'Rosh Chodesh ve'echad b'Chanukah. Again, you have 3 things to read, so 3 Sifrei Torah. Utzricha. Why do you need to say them both? If you said it by Hanukkah, you might say, if you have like Rav, you would read Rosh Chodesh, and you would read Rosh Chodesh again, let's say, maybe you read it twice, I don't know, but it's all in the same place. You wouldn't need a separate Torah for that. Whereas, therefore, he comes to teach you, I don't hold like Rav, I hold like Shmuel, and that's why you need 3 Sifrei Torah. So why don't you just say it by Rosh Chodesh? Adar and not by Tevet. And we would know, obviously, in Tevet, if Rosh Chodesh falls, you would obviously need 3 Torahs. So they say in the end, he really didn't say them both. The second statement was just derived from the first, and they said it in his name, even though he didn't actually say it, because there's really no reason to say it. Itmar. Now we're going to have a machlok. Rosh Chodesh Tevet shechali bechol. What if Rosh Chodesh Tevet falls on, since we were talking about Rosh Chodesh Tevet on a Shabbat, what if it falls on a weekday? Now you have to read Rosh Chodesh and you have to read Chanukah. So, and you have 4 aliyot. And how many aliyot do you read of each? How do you split them? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, karutzlata beRosh Chodesh v'chad b'Chanukah. You read 3 about Rosh Chodesh, 1 of Chanukah. For Rav Dimi d'min Chayfa amar, karutzlata b'Chanukah v'chad b'Rosh Chodesh. She says the reverse. Okay, this is going to sound a little like the machloket of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Which comes first? Do you do the wine or the kiddush? Remember that machloket? Amar Rabbi Mani kavatei Rabbi Yitzchak nafcha mistabra de tadir v'sheino tadir kodem. We do what's regular, the one that comes more often. That's Rosh Chodesh. It happens more than Chanukah. Chanukah is 8 days a year. Rosh Chodesh is 12 plus, usually 18 because there's 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. Amar, and therefore 3 for Rosh Chodesh, only 1 for Chanukah. Amar Rabbi Avin kavatei Rav Dimi mistabra. Mi garam l'revi'i sheyavo Rosh Chodesh. This is like who caused it to, right? To say Kiddush, the wine. So therefore we go with the wine, right? These are arguments that are both said there. So who caused this 4th one? Rosh Chodesh, because remember, it's Rosh Chodesh that you need 4 aliyot for. So therefore, Hilkach Revi'i Rosh Chodesh b'ayin mikra. So therefore, the 4th one has to be Rosh Chodesh. My Havela. So what's the story? Rav Yosef Amar Ema Shechim b'Rosh Chodesh, Rav Amar Ema Shechim b'Chanukah. Okay, they each have a different opinion about it. The Hilchata Ema Shechim b'Chanukah v'Rosh Chodesh Ikar. Rosh Chodesh is the central one. Okay, and therefore it gets more mileage, more aliyot about Rosh Chodesh. With that, we're going to end. We'll start with this next section in tomorrow's Shiur. Have a great day, everybody.